think we'll start early, or meaning on time, really. I'm just going to make sure I'm in a different venue with different technology. Everybody hears me? Is that we're working here? Thumbs up. Excellent. Good. Okay, so we're going to do Psalm 49, and while I'm reading also, I just want to give credit to Edward and another student of mine, Michael, who's not here, and Tikva, who maybe will come, just about how much they are participating really in the readings today, because we've been meeting in the mornings and we started to go over a series of Psalms. Now, it's important to think about 49 as part of a series, because as I wrote to some of you, it very much is part of a series. We've talked about attribution of the Psalms, and these Psalms are attributed to the Sons of Korach. So we're interested in this, not because we want to identify historically exactly what happened and when. I was looking online for Psalms lectures, right, to see what's out there. And there's some probably Bar Ilan professor who was saying, he's going to explain all the Psalms. He's a history professor, through understanding the history of the Second and First Temple period. And I'm like, that's the last thing I want, because that's the kind of reading that actually, that's the kind of interpretation that just closes down other readings. It says, oh, this is what happened, which is very similar. We talked about this a little last week, and when I was reading Psalm 49, I read Robert Alter, whose translation is really admirable. But he says, and he does this often, he says, well, this psalm is clearly in the wisdom genre. Apparently, there's a wisdom genre of Psalms, a coronations genre of Psalms, and it certainly is a useful category. But it becomes for editors a kind of like throwaway. Oh, it's in the wisdom. It's a wisdom psalm, right? And then suddenly I know something about the psalm without actually having read it. And the truth is, I don't even know what a wisdom psalm is. So that whole label kind of just pushes me away from the text and makes me feel like an inadequate reader, which I don't want to feel like, right? Anyway, so I think those are really important about the Psalms. And so what we do care about is, what are the attributions? When it says of the sons of Korach, what do the people in the interpretive tradition say these people are? Why is that important to us? Because then we're seeing traditions of interpretation that come out of that. And whether it's true or not, right, we don't care. I mean, even the whole idea of whether it's true, it should really be foreign. This idea of verisimilitude has infected every aspect of life, right? And and to say that something is not verisimilar or not true, well, then you're a subjective relativist. I'll go on that tirade some other time. Anyway, so one attribution is that the sons of Korach were literally the sons of Korach, and there are midrashim that say that Korach sons were chozer b'tshuva. They sat on the edge of the pit as Korach was falling down into it, and they were singing praises to God, probably these, and they were so they're the authors of these psalms. And they authored these psalms in order that the Levium in the temple would sing them. And I mentioned this in the email, that these psalms are very much connected to place, and the place being whether to place in the abstract, but also place as in Israel, Jerusalem, and the Beit HaMikdash. The other interpretation is that David somehow sang these songs with a certain kind of Ruach HaKodesh, because of course the temple, even the Beit HaMikdash, is not built by David. So he has Ruach HaKodesh, he sees into the future, and the sons of Korach are the ancestors, sorry, the continuation of Korach's line in the generation of the temple, right? I mean, I'm just putting those out there, and they may be interesting, when we start to understand things a little bit better. What's the difference in how we read the Psalms according to those two perspectives? So 42 through 49 are part of this collection. And while we were reading them together, it seems there's a kind of pattern. And I'll mention to you in Psalm 47, and I think another one as well, we see the term maskil. Remember, have you seen that? If you've ever been at a high holiday service and you've heard the shofar blown, Psalm 47 is the one that's intoned 7 times before the guy actually blows the shofar. right? And and part of it is God's name emerges, goes out with a truah, this sound of God's name going up. And in that psalm, a maskil is mentioned, and it's qualified by a plural verb. So all the Meforshim, all the commentaries want to know what's going on here. And the Radak says, I think it's very beautiful. I would like to find out more about the Radak, because he seems to have lived in a time where he could express really universalist ideas. So he says, well, all these psalms, and he says many times that when David is singing at the end of his psalm, he's singing not just for him, but for all of Israel. It's for everybody. And the Radak repeats that they're for everybody. But the maskil is the person who is able to take the different psalms and edit them. And that editing, thinking of it in slightly different terms, the maskil puts all of the voices together and is able to make one thing out of all those voices, which for anybody who's a teacher, that's what the maskil is, right? To be able to bring the voices together, to allow all of the voices to speak. So that's the difference between the maskil, the enlightened one, the person who can see how everybody else is part of something. And that also has editorial consequences, because what he's saying is that there is a maskil here, and the editor, whoever that was, put this thing together, these 150 psalms, which is kind of inviting the interpretation that we're pushing towards now, which is, first of all, saying, how do these 8 psalms function together? And I'm really, really sure that after we get through 150, we will be able to think about how these 8 psalms function in the psalms as a whole. I mean, if you're skeptical of that, think of plays by Shakespeare, in which there are scenes that seem really irrelevant. They don't seem to be necessary. Comic scenes, extrinsic scenes, and directors will very often pull them out of their productions. But a careful reader will often see that those scenes themselves, they're not a key to the play, but they are a key to the play. There's nothing wasted in Shakespeare, right? He doesn't waste anything. There's no just any ha-ha moments. There are ha-ha moments, but they're always doing other things as well. So I think the same thing is true of the psalmist, or that's the approach here. We'll start with the Psalm 49 in a minute, but I wanted to give you some highlights. And I know this is really like not Kedarko, not like we usually do. We don't usually do highlights for exactly the reason I think that I just said, that we're interested in the way in which verses, not only are we interested in the way in which psalms function in the whole, we're interested in the way in which verses function in individual psalms. So we're kind of doing violence to that, and I apologize to that, but I do think it's worth it. I think it's worth it. So the first one, and not only are these psalms and part of an 8 psalm unit, but they are also the first part of the second book of Psalms. So and I don't know why these books exist as they do, I've never seen any commentary on it, but somebody thought that 41 was the ending and this is a beginning, which of course gives us even more reason to think about the Psalms as a unit. Now, this is after the title line of this psalm. This is the first line of the psalm. And sorry, just one second. And I think people know it, maybe, right? Perhaps people do know it. I think it's probably one of the more famous lines in Psalms. I mean, even the Hebrew, Ka'al ta'arug alafiki mayim, kein nafshi ta'arug alecha Elokim. Ka'al ta'arug alafiki mayim, kein nafshi ta'arug alecha Elokim. So as the heart, are we happy with that? Ayil? That's good for us? Ta'arug, ta'arug. I don't know if we have to sit on every one of these words. I'm just always tempted to do so. What does ta'arog mean? Is this pleasure?
It's pining.
Long for, panting for, alafike maim, right? They got to get the desperation in there. Kain nafshi ta'arog elecha Elokim. So my soul, and the soul is personified in these first few psalms for some reason. There are like 2 aspects to the person. So my soul ta'arug elecha Elokim. So my soul is longing for you. And that we see here not only our place in nature, but now the longing for God is put in very, very physical terms, right? People who are habituated, like me and some of my students, to 17th century literature, like the poetry of John Donne, and sometimes Shakespeare, we're used to seeing like the ways in which spiritual and physical overlap. But this is really very striking. And I think a lot of the culture of Shakespeare and Donne and Milton, as we've been talking about, comes from David. So it's a very physical sense of desire. We're in a particular place, and we feel, and we've seen this before, but it's stronger, I think, now. We feel the physicality of faith, or the physicality. There is desire in worship, and that's kind of controversial for people, but that's meaning anytime desire is kind of brought into the conversation, it either turns into people jumping outside of a van with white caps on, dancing in the street, or it gets pushed off as something without any meaning, because of course we don't talk about the realm of desire. Anyway, 42 introduces us to that. This is, and here's another line from 42. And the soul in this narrative is feeling really bad. And so now David said, then the psalmist says, Elo eskara ve'eshkafa alai nafshi. When I remember these things, ki avor basach adadem ad beit elokim b'kol rina v'toda hamon chogeg. Let's just see what Geneva says about this, since this translation seems unsatisfying. Psalm 49. Okay.
You're looking for 42 rather than 49.
Playing very loud music. Is that you, Tikva?
Sorry, no, that's Danielle. I'm in a coffee shop.
All right. Okay, so as the heart brayeth for the rivers of water. See, this is interesting also. So panted my soul after thee. So they found that the same verb in the simile, they found it a little bit weird, right? Sorry, this is up here, right? Tarog. And that's notable. Usually the vehicle and the tenor will be different in subject and verb, and it's not different here. And the Geneva translators actually turn it into something different because they want to distinguish, right? That's an interesting story just in that one translation of that one line. Here's line 5. Why art thou cast down, my soul, and unquiet within me? Wait on God. I don't know what that's doing. We'll go back to the Hebrew in a second. For I will yet give thanks for the help of his presence. Okay, so here let's look at the Hebrew. Elis garash kafa alai nafshi ki avar basach adadem ad beit elokim. So what's being described here is this kind of basach adadem. Hebrew speakers, how would we translate this best?
We will tread until the house of God.
Right. Want to pass. And sach is this move slowly, walk deliberately. Beit Elokim b'kol rina v'toda hamon chogeg. This crowd-keeping holiday. And they're also having a problem with it here. Give him thanks for the help of his presence. Weird. Oh, sorry, I'm in the wrong one. The lines are different. Sorry. When I remembered these things, I poured out my very heart because I had gone with the multitude. Guys, like that I made that lapsus there, it was horrible, and that nobody stopped me was also horrible, right? I know, I'm sorry, that was bad. And led them into the house of God with a voice of singing and praise as a multitude that keepeth a feast. Poured out my heart. And then he when his heart is complaining, he remembers going up with the multitude in a throng. And I think in this verse, on the one hand, we see this public persona of the person going now to the Beit HaMikdash. Again, there's this emphasis on place, and everybody is thronging there. But also, I think this verse, the latter part of this verse seems very formal to me. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking, I mean, maybe this is just me, and it could be, but I'm wondering, do I want to be part of this Hamon Chogeg? I mean, it just sounds very, very public and congregational. And I think I'm justified in saying that because the nafshi is so far away from this very public persona, which appears again in different psalms. And here's a something else kind of along those lines. How there's a difference here. Before we saw a difference between the public persona and the private existential angst, and I think that's what it was or is. And then in Psalm 44, Tikva gave us a great reading of this. In Psalm 44, we see the beginning of the psalm, Elokim ba'aznenu shamanu avotenu. Sounds like the beginning of the Pesach Seder, right? Elokim ba'aznenu shamanu avotenu. Sipur lanu, right? It's like Sipur Yitziat Mitzrayim. Sipur lanu, pa'alta b'yamehem b'yamei kedem. What is the resonance of b'yamei kedem? It's in the liturgies. Well, in times of old. And I think that's an adequate translation here. It's very formalized. It sounds like a little bit like King Arthur and his court, right? Doesn't it give you that sense? I always wondered how that figures in the liturgy because that also seems very foreign to me.
In the olden times.
In olden times, right? So here, right, so that we heard those stories. We heard all those great stories about our forefathers. The psalmist will later on in this psalm go on to rebuke God. He will say, like, we heard about these stories of our fathers, but like, what about us? And this psalm also, 44, also emphasizes this disparity between a kind of public persona and then like we know these stories, but what about how we live? We were talking in our group about if anybody has read the Medea of Euripides, right? The chorus comes out at the beginning, sometime in the beginning of the play. One of the characters says, we're sick of the kind of poets who are writing this poetry of noble men and noble women and of consolation and of happiness. Those poems don't have anything to do with us anymore, right? So there's Euripides kind of trashing Homer, right? He's saying the coherence of the Homeric narrative. It's a great story, but that's not how we live. That's like the amazing what Euripides does. He kind of pokes a hole in that. And you see kind of, and in 44, you see kind of the same thing here. Here's that rebuke. Tatnenu kutson ma'achal uvagoyim zeiri tanu. That has given us like sheep to be eaten. This one I mentioned because we'll see it again, this the metaphor of sheep in particular in 49. Here, yeah, we got to read this one. Tasimenu mashal bugoyim, midrosh minod rosh be'ulumim. So the latter part is kind of this physical disapproval, right? Has anybody ever looked at you or made that kind of gesture to you? I mean, I hope not, right? But probably yes. What does it mean, tasimenu mashal b'goyim? I mean, this is crucial to us today because it will play a huge thematic role in 49. So I want to think a little bit about what does this mean, tasimenu mashal b'goyim? What does it mean to be a mashal? What is a mashal, by the way?
Mashal is a type of allegory, direct translation.
Yeah, I mean, kind of allegory. So mashal, I mean, we could describe a mashal. There's the mashal and the nimshal and the mashal. And we could describe that in the same way that we describe really a metaphor. Now, mashal is very powerful. We'll talk about the possibilities of mashal in a minute. But here in this context, they have become like a mashal, a byword, meaning when I look at them, what am I seeing? Or why does this bother the psalmist so much? In Milton's adaptation of the story from Judges, Samson Agonistes, it's Milton's taking of a Hebrew story and turning it into a Greek tragedy. It's very, very depressing. And one of the things that happens in the story is that the nation, one of Delilah comes back to him, and Samson is very confident at first. He says, I don't care about you. In my books, you're a minor character. You're a villain. The Philistines lose out. And Delilah turns back to Samson in Milton's work and says, we have our own books. We don't care about your books. In my book, I'm the hero. And Delilah's kind, and this is real, this is what gets under Samson's skin, because Delilah is like a multiculturalist, and Samson can only deal with the one truth, right? So that's what's happening here, is the psalmist is being turned into a story, into a mashal in my story, in the story of the pagans, right? Your own story is irrelevant, right? You're a proverb in our culture, and that's it. We'll see again. We'll see in 49. We'll explore this a little further. So we're doing two things. We just took a little detour into the land of Mashal and language and what it does or can do. And now we're going back to that kind of progression. We saw different kinds of what I would call alienation, internal, external. And Psalm 45 is just this kind of explosion of happiness. It's incredible. I mean, Ed gave us this reading, and we recorded it. It's online. It was just such a revelation to me to hear how he was reading it, because it seems so opaque to me. Meaning, why is there so much? There's kingship. There's the glory of kingship. There's the feminine queen obedient to the king. Lots of things that kind of make you want to push it off. And we had a discussion. I'll mention some of the things that this psalm does. It becomes a turning point in the Psalms 42 to 49, because after this, we don't have the same kind of dichotomy, duality that we saw earlier. So I'm seeing which lines I put here. Somehow I liked all the lines about the feminine, because it really dovetailed with some of the discussions we had earlier. Hearken, O daughter, and consider and incline thy ear. That's also, that verb is important there. Hati aznech, listen to me. Later on, the psalmist in 49 is going to talk about him listening. Vishichachi amech, and forget your land. Ubeit avicha, and this is also obviously a reminiscent of Lech Lecha, right? In Genesis, go leave your land, leave your father. And so, I mean, clearly, we're not pushing it here when we have to say we need to look at this in the perspective of all of Jewish history. And the bat here is something extrinsic to the Jews that is coming inside. It is the feminine. And Ed pointed out, like, we've had all this anxiety about, and we've been talking about this, all this anxiety about David's provenance. What's David worried about? I mean, a lot of things are bothering David, but what are the top three? Bathsheba, right?
His son also.
His son, and then Solomon marries somebody else who converts, right? And that reminds us of the third one, which is really the first one, Ruth, who's a convert, right? And there's all this anxiety around David's relationship to his feminine predecessors and the one and his wife and the one that comes after. And here in this psalm, all of those anxieties are revolved. The feminine comes inside. Ubatsur b'mincha panayich yachalu ashiri am. And O daughter of Tzur, the rich among the people shall entreat thy favor with gifts. It's interesting right now. And earlier we saw the feminine was problematic. Now everybody is giving her gifts. And when you look at 45, you'll think to yourself for a minute, wow, this sounds kind of pagan because of all of this pomp and circumstance. And you're wondering, like, we've read all of this anti-externality stuff in the Psalms so far. And then we see an emphasis on the king's clothing and her clothing. Kol kvuda bat melech penima. The king's daughter is a beautiful line. Kol kvuda bat melech penima mimishbatzot zahav lavusha. One more time. Kol kfuda bat melech, all of the glory, kfuda, the heaviness, the glory of the daughter of the king, pnima. How do you pronounce this word properly? Mi mishbatzot zahav.
משבצות זהב
Look what happens here, is we start with the glory, then we go pnima, and then we go external again. The pnima, if you look at the line, horizontally, the pnima is right in the middle, right? So it's amazing because it's not just pnima pushing off what came before. It's the pnima that qualifies what comes before and then emerges again. It emerges again at the end in the external, right? And then again, and then finally to talk about in this psalm, the integration of the feminine. And when we first read this, I thought this kind of reminds me of a Shakespearean comedy. What happens at the end of Shakespearean comedies? Everybody gets married. There's just this promise of futurity, of continuity. So here, tachat avotecha yuvanecha. Instead of thy fathers shall be thy children. That is a line from As You Like It. Why talk we of fathers when there is such a man as Orlando, right? Why talk we about the past when there's somebody in the future? Tachat avotecha yuvanecha. Tasitenu l'sarim b'chol haaretz, whom thou shalt make princes in all the earth. The haaretz here, b'chol haaretz, there's a lot to do with that in the other poems as well. And then azkira shebcha b'chol dor v'dor. So it goes from the, this kind of beautiful resolution. It goes from the generational, and then it comes further out. Right, and right into kind of the future, le'olam vo'ed, to eternity. Okay, so I think we should go to 49. Right away in 46, without even reading this carefully, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holiest dwelling place of the Most High. Suddenly, all the angst that we were feeling before in 43 and 44, that's gone, right? And we're in this place, the dwelling place of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. God shall help her at the dawn of the day. There's amazing stuff here. On the one hand, there's the presence of the divine. It's very important, actually. Well, the Beit HaMikdash is the presence of God. And here now we're having the sense of, is there Bikirba here? Yeah, Bikirba. God is present, internal. We've been talking a little bit about immanence. How does the spiritual, how does it saturate or become part of the physical? Well, the Beit HaMikdash, that is the place where it happens. And here we're seeing it, maybe we'll see it in other places as well. We see it in the people of Israel. Okay. And then again, here's 48. Walk about Zion and go round about her. Sipru b'migdaleha, count her towers, mark them. Watch her bulwarks, her bulwarks, and then there's again the repetition of Tisapru lador acharon. You will continue to see. You've seen this place again, spatial, temporal. You've seen this place. Now continue to tell about it from generation to generation. Okay. Okay, so let's just pause for a second. I'm going to take 35 seconds just to pause. And you can think if you have a question for me. Welcome, Dove. We are recording. Whoa, okay. Okay, here we go. Let's do it. Okay. L'manatzech livnei Korach mizmor. This is the last one in the series. Shimu zot kol ha'amim v'hazinu kol yoshvei Chaled. What does the word Chaled mean? We discussed this once before. It means world, but it also has the connotations of rust. Is that correct, Hebrew speakers? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so world, and so why is that? And when I read it, when I understand it from this point of view of rust,
yes.
I think of entropy, right? Right, the world is declining, right? But he says, and he's calling, so the world is declining. Gam b'nei Adam, gam b'nei ish yachad ashir ve'evyon. So this is certainly universalist, right? B'nai Adam u B'nai Ish. If you were interpreting this poem from the perspective of the tradition of the rabbis of Tanakh, how would you do B'nai Adam, B'nai Ish? What would you do with that? I mean, whatever, it's a problem, right? Why is there a repetition? So I think, I'm not sure if I'm getting this right. I think B'nai Adam is the descendants of Abraham, and the B'nai Ish is the descendants of Noah, right? So, and that's the emphasis on, I think the Radak says that, which is kind of emphasis on the universal. This poem is for everybody, low and high, rich and poor together. Okay. I think this is a hard one. I'm just saying, right? Pi yedaber chachmot v'hagot libi tfuna. Pi, my mouth, will speak chachmot, wisdom, v'hagot libi tfunot. Who writes like that, right? My mouth will speak wisdoms, v'hagot libi tfuna. And you see, like the interpreters have there's a problem here. The problem is what to do with that word tfunot, because it's just hanging there, right? So what do they do? My mouth shall speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart shall be understanding. Is that there? No, right? One thing I like about the Geneva translators is that they actually, when they are playing fast and loose, they tell you, right? They're saying we're adding this is here, right? By italicizing it. So what they're telling you in their translation is there's an interpretation and we made it and we're adding this here, which is very responsible, right? So what do we do here? What do we do this tfunot? Now I'm thinking, and I'm already have an interest in the way I'm interpreting this because I've read the whole thing already. But I'm thinking that a lot of this poem is going to be about not the representation of the divine in the world in the Beit HaMikdash, but the representation of the divine in the world through language. What can poetry do? We said at the beginning, David is interested in ideas of courage, of selfhood, of identity, of song, of prayer, but also of language. What is it that language does? Now, interestingly, in the Midrashim on Shir HaShirim, Solomon's song, the rabbis use it as a way of saying, they say before Solomon, there really was no need for interpretation. People were religious because of fear of God. Rabbis say this, okay? But Solomon understood that this was no longer going to work anymore. So really, in short, what he does is he invents sacred poetry. What is sacred poetry? What would sacred poetry do? So let's go back to where I said we would start with Aristotle. Metaphor is usually thought of as the trope of transference, translatio, in which the unknown or half-known is described and clarified through a course to what is better known. Metaphor is a trope of transference, translatio, that's the Latin. Translatio means to carry over. I carry over from one realm into another, in which the unknown or half-known is described and clarified through recourse to what is better known. My love is like a red, red rose. Of course, that's a simile, not a metaphor, but the same thing applies. So this love is an abstraction that I can't really understand. So metaphor makes it physical, and I can see it. Not only can I see it better, I can actually see it. Now, of course, there are limits to metaphor as well. Solomon is interested because he sees that fear of God is not enough. The people need more. And he invents a sacred poetry in which the well-known is this world, or the or in the well-known, the better known is this world, and the unknown is the divine. Aristotle doesn't get into this, right? This is the way we're reading now in the Jewish tradition. It's David and the rabbis. In the Christian tradition, it's Augustine and Paul and Luther. The idea that there is something beyond what is seen, and that everybody believes that. The chidush is, and this is the sacred nature of language, is that poetry can do this, that language can do this, that language can jump over the physical into the non-physical, that through language I can represent the divine. Right? Any Maimonidean here is now jumping up and down and saying, how can that be, right? Maimonides, the rationalist who seems to be against images, he's got something to say about midrashim that deal with this. Not our issue at the moment. The idea is, I mean, it's interesting. Let me show you this thing from Shir HaShirim, the midrashim on Shir HaShirim, and it's describing that the Torah is this giant pool, but it's totally inaccessible. So you have to lower down a kli, a dli, this thing that brings up water, a bucket. And in order to do that, you have to tie different strings to each other, chevel b'chevel, meshicha b'mishicha, and then you pull it up. And here's the part, if you know Hebrew, kach midavar ledavar mi mashal lemashal. So the strings, and you have to read it more, there's a lot going on here, but these strings, the way I get to the truth of revelation is through mashalim. And not only one, but different ones that are somehow tied together. And this is like this. So the rabbis say in their historiography of sacred poetry, Solomon is the one who did this. He is the one who allowed for this kind of relationship. Okay, let's go. So now we're continuing now. I would say here also, going back here, my mouth will speak, and now we go to wisdom. And now we go further inside, meditations. And now we go further inside to my heart. And now we go further inside to understanding, right? In a way, David, the psalmist here, is mapping out the process through which the P finds out what he has to say. I mean, Pi yidaber chachmot v'hagaot libi tfunot. And the way I'm reading it, it's okay, because it's a series, right? I'm not adding any verb. We go from here, strangely, from external to internal. And here to now, this is one of the lines to which I was referring to earlier when we looked at 44 and the woman, the nations of the world, leaving her father and tilting her ear towards the king. And here the psalmist is saying, Atala Mashal. Wow, right? I am leaning towards the Mashal. As ni aftach b'kinor chidati. I will incline my ear to a parable, to a metaphor. Parable. I will open eftach b'chinor chidati, and I will open my riddle with my lyre. Atala mashal. What's the mashal? Whatever that mashal is, and he's hearing it, he is, through his singing with his lyre, b'chinor, he is going to express his riddle. I'm thinking about the relationship between 4 and 5, not sure yet. So he leans into the mashal. I mean, it's not clear what it is. Rashi says it's the Torah, and I think that's a reading we can go with, not ruling out other readings. Atel mashal, azni eftach b'chinor chidati. I mean, if I'm reading like Rashi, he's reading just like I was reading Solomon, right? I'm going to turn my ear to what you're saying, and I'm going to express I'm going to express it. Chidati, my riddle. I'm going to express what I have to say, which is also going to need to be interpreted Bechinor, Beliar, in my Psalms. Okay. Then the psalmist goes on and says, why should I fear in the days of evil when the iniquity of my persecutors compasses me about? That they trust in their wealth, habotchim al chelam, ubarov ashram yithalalu, boast themselves in the translation is okay, habotchim al chelam, they trust in their money, in their wealth. You know people like this, by the way? Right, I know, I live in a Haredi neighborhood, so that's one of the good things about living in a Haredi neighborhood. It's people are not like this because they don't have any money. Right, but Ronnie, you're in Teaneck? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in the cheaper side of Teaneck, but yes.
I'm sure
But
you
Chelam there's a lot of but there's power also in Chelam Chayil, right? It's not only money, is it?
Right.
Is it only
no, you're right,
money?
for sure, right. The Chayal, who's the soldier, right?
I mean, to quote Scarface, first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the woman. But
glad you said that, and I'm being. Go ahead, yeah.
Yes, Miami. Al Chelam, yeah. I mean, about him. There's so many people who, right? You trust on power, but obviously that's a major theme running through, right? That you can't trust that.
Right.
Your horses.
Right.
Don't trust your horses, right? You know that which is true and not true, right? And we see, if you have a really strong army, you probably will win.
Okay, Ronnie, we can get philosophical, but right, I think he's talking about, listen, right, David is a soldier, right? And the trust that we're talking about, a kind of trust that goes beyond what David's trust is. David's trust in his arms, and he obviously has them, is also qualified by his trust in God. This is not, right? I love this. Lo fada yifte ish lo yitain lelokim kapro. Here is so you can read it different ways. We saw earlier, hey ach, alas, alas. Maybe not, that's not shot here. Lo fada yifte, you can't, a person with their money, right, is great, as good as it is, you can't salvage somebody else's soul, right? V'yekar pidyon nafsham v'chadal le'olam. This is a hard one to read. V'yekar pidyon nafsham. V'yekar pidyon nafsham.
V'yekar pidyon nafsham.
V'chadal le'olam. Who's leaving it forever? So the wealthy person. Right, I can't keep, and here we're talking about not money. It costs me too much to actually satisfy my soul. So I'll go on vacation instead. And the cost here is not monetary, it's that I would have to actually give of myself, and I can't do that. Is that satisfying? I'm not saying it's exhaustive. You don't like it?
I'm trying to understand it.
Let's continue. V'yichi od lenetzach. Now, what does this person think? He thinks he's going to live forever. Lo yirah hashachat. And he will never see what's beneath him. He will never see the pit. He will never go down. The person who lives.
It's like stairways. It's like Stairway to Heaven.
Kind of, right? Yeah. Danielle, what were you saying? Someone? Netzach here, I think, again, is this idea of the circumscribed eternal, right? Le'olam va'ed is more having to do with the divine. And this guy thinks he's going to live forever. And that's why he's using Netzach here, because his version of Netzach is very, very limited. He doesn't even know the Le'olam va'ed. He doesn't fear hell, going down to Gehenna, to Shachat. Ki yira chachamim yamotu yachad psil uvar yovedu va'azvu la'acherim chelam. When he sees that wise men die, that the fool and brute perish together, and leave their thought, their wealth to others. We have to follow, like, what's happening internally here. Their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call the lands after their own names. Let's keep on reading just for a second. So we get to the end, and then we'll go back. Their inward thought is their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling place to all generations. They call their lands, Adamot, we haven't seen that before, after their own names. Why is that important? Nevertheless, man, Bal Yalin, he does not abide in honor. Let's go with their translation. And here we're coming back to that word Mashal, which we saw in an earlier psalm, and we saw here. 4 times Mashal appears in Tehillim. 3 of them are in this poem. So that means we can pay attention, right? Nimshal behemot nidmu. Not only is it they are like animals, they are like, right? It's weird, right? The nidmu is also to appear like. This is their way and their folly, and their posterity, and those who come after them, b'fihem yirtzu sela, and those who approve of the things that come from their mouth, their sayings. So we're talking about mashalim in 13 and 14. We're talking about the sayings of these people. Here now we have, like sheep, they are pointed to Shaul. They have kitson l'shaul shatu. Shatu means what here?
Throne, no?
Pardon?
Is it like throne?
Right, said, appointed, right? There is a lack of agency here. They're destined. Kitson l'shul shatu mavet. Oh, sorry. Mavet yirem v'yardu vam yesharim levoker. And therefore, this is v'yardu vam yesharim levoker. Okay. V'tzuram livlot. Shaul mizvul lo. Let's see what they do with this.
Mizbal is like waste.
Their beauty shall consume. All right, so they're also not kind of touching it. What does soram mean here?
Their forms.
So is the psalmist the first Aristotelian? Everybody, of course, remembers the Ramban, right, Dov? The Ramban in Genesis, where he talks about hilo, the Greek idea of matter, right? He actually quotes the Greek word. See, you can learn non-Jewish sources. The Ramban says hilo, right? And so the Aristotelian, so he's borrowing an Aristotelian categories between matter and form. Now, David is not in that tradition. The psalmist is not in that tradition. But here we have this idea of their form being wasted. I have more to say about this. Let's continue. We're going to have to think together in a second. Ach, I love this. Remember our ach up here? Ach lo pada yifta, right? Here, we get a different ach, right? Ach elokim yifta nafshi, right? But my soul, God will rescue. Miyad shul ki yikacheni sela. Al tiraki yasher ish ki yirba kavod beito. Do not fear when you see that somebody else's glory is increasing. You know what Schadenfreude is?
Yes.
Everybody, of course, knows what Schadenfreude is, right? When you get pleasure out of other people failing. So don't worry that somebody is going to be successful. Be not afraid when one is made rich, when the glory of his house is increased. For when he dies, he shall carry nothing away. Right, you see the kavodo at the end of the line, his glory, it's at the very bottom, it's down, right? He's happy when he lives, he blesses himself. ki tetiv lach. And he even praises you, Baruch Hashem, right? You know that stock deal that I was making, you know, that IPO, Baruch Hashem, right? Love that, right? I'm sure you love it, Ronnie, right? At the kiddushes, the jewels, right? Baruch Hashem. I made more money this week than Ronnie made last 3 years. Baruch Hashem.
Not hard.
Right? Tavo ador vador avotav ad netzach lo yira or. They will never see the light. Boom. Adam beyakar. Here's a repetition. V'lo yavin nimshal kebehemot nidmo.
But this is everybody.
Wait. Adam beyikar.
Sorry.
V'lo yavin nimshal kebehemot nidmo. Is that right? Yeah, I think. Yeah. Okay. I just want to do a little review here. See if we can do something with this. The first thing we had is the Mashal of the Goyim looking at the psalmist and saying, you're in our story. Here, the psalmist inclines to Torah. He says this riddle. He expresses himself b'kinur. Now, I guess I want to focus on these 2 lines. Where's the Yalin? Did I miss that again? Here. V'adam b'yikar bal Yalin. Nimshalga behemot nidmo. I think, and this goes back, and this is really why I wanted to mention the things that we read before about the relationship between the divine and the human is V'adam b'yikar bal yalim. He will not dwell. He will not dwell in his honor. I'm thinking maybe there's the dwelling that we saw of God earlier in 44 and 45. This guy wants to dwell in honor, and he can't. He is like nimshalka b'behemot nidmo. He is like, what does it mean? Why this comparison? Nimshalka b'behemot nidmo. Am I asking a good enough question now? I also want to know about this loss of form. Why is there a loss of form? Why is that part of the destiny of this person? And what defines this person? And I'm gonna start where I finished the last time I thought about this, and hopefully we'll catch up to myself. These people are literalists. They don't know how to read. They don't know that language can mean more than there is. They just think what is. They live in a world where their wealth and their image in the world, very Platonic, that's what there is. And when the psalmist describes them and says they're like animals, well, they don't know this, but that's what they are. In Paradise Lost, believe me, I think this will help. Satan is given a text to read. The text is from Genesis, and he will bruise your head. Adam will bruise the head of the serpent, the snake, Satan. And Milton says, as Milton Satan says, what's the big deal? It's only a bruise, right? I don't care. I don't care about a bruise. Of course, good readers in Jewish and Christian traditions know that the bruise is not just a bruise. The bruise is more than a bruise. But Satan is another figure of the literalist. He can only see what's in front of him. So when the psalmist calls the the wealthy, when he compares them to animals, he's saying, you don't know what you really are. And that's why when they go down to hell, they lose their form. They have no form. They were once an image, and that's all they were, and now they're nothing. Now they're just matter. Now they're matter without form. They denied that there's any image beyond their own. And when they go down to hell, they kind of find out, well, kind of, yeah, for you, that's the truth. The last line of the poem, I think, maybe makes things a little clearer. I mean, one of the questions to ask here is, if these are 8 poems in a unit, why are we ending here, right? And I gave you a kind of picture of this. There's the going up, there's the crescendo of the king and his kingdom and this and Jerusalem and God abiding in Jerusalem. And now we're kind of petering out here, right? It's all kind of negative, right? I mean, we're going to the guy who says he's experiencing, and this, I guess, is a poem of consolation, meaning you see wealth. And Danielle pointed out another Psalm 73 in which this is happening. You see the wealthy around you, and it gives you a cause to despair. But if you put your ear to the Torah, you won't see it that way. And when you put your ear to the Torah, well, that's something you also need to do, is you need to learn how to read the Torah. The pagan, right? The pagan, he will never see the light because there is no light. There is nothing beyond. Now look at the shift here. Before we had lo yali, right? Adam beyeker lo yali. A man in his honor will not dwell. Here we have Adam beikar lo yavin. In his wealth, he understands not. He understands not. Nimshalka behemot nidno. He doesn't even get the last 3 lines of the poem. So we end this series of poems. We go up and we go down. Really, for readers of fans of Paradise Lost here, wow, it's very, very kind of resonant, right? I mean, Paradise Lost ends when Adam and Eve leave the Garden of Eden. It ends when they go into history, right? And it doesn't end in glory. It ends in historical reality. And the shape of these 8 Psalms is kind of similar. We do have this sense of apotheosis in the beginning, in the middle, but the poem kind of peters out into the present. And it's really kind of giving a warning to people, right? You've seen this. You've seen the way in which the spiritual can inhabit the physical. The divine can be present in the people of Israel, in Jerusalem. You've seen that. And once you know that, I mean, that's the guarantee, really. That moment, and the Shekhinah in a way is a kind of, this is me, not anybody else, is kind of a guarantee of that relationship between the physical and the spiritual. There we see it happening. I mean, it is that privileged site, right? The privileged site where the physical and the spiritual come together. But we see it, and then we see it in the city of Jerusalem, which is already located in a place, and there's weather and all sorts of things. But by the end of the poem, we're back into history. And the psalmist is saying to you, you better learn how to read. And if you don't, and how do you remember how to read? You remember what just happened in this whole cycle, right? If you don't remember what happened in this whole cycle, the possibility of the divine coming into relationship with the human, well, that's the key to understanding metaphor and how it works. The wealthy of the world do not have that understanding. Lo yavin. And you can even read it like I'm reading it. Lo yavin nimshal, right? Lo yavin nimshal behemot. They are compared to behemot nidmu. They are like them. So poetry, we started out with the fetish of verisimilitude. But the fetish of verisimilitude is one of the things that kills poetry, right? Because there just is what there is, right? There's nothing more. And if you say there's anything more, it makes you a mystic or crazy, right? But the rabbis are saying, and that it is through language that the non-physical can be expressed. And David is giving a lesson, or the psalmist here is giving a lesson, not in good reading. I mean, I guess the earlier Psalms, I think we could read all 8 of them again and see the progression perhaps a little bit better. There's the teaching of what you need to know in order to read, and then we see the history of those who don't know how to read. What do you say, people?
Thank you so much for the interesting lectures.
You're welcome, Guy. Comments, questions?
What I find very powerful here is also that it's about consciousness. It's not promising anything different in the end, so to speak. The difference is how you live. You live like an animal, thinking that as long as you have grass, you're going to be okay, you know, or do you live realizing that there's more, even if you don't know what that more is, right?
I mean, now that you mentioned that, animals, I mean, I told Tikva when we were researching this that she should remind herself of Circe's island in the Odyssey, where the sailors all drink from her cup and they're all reduced animals. They lose their form.
Oh,
Right?
interesting.
The language of the group of Psalms that you read, to me recollects the language of Parshas Ha'azinu, and a lot of the same thoughts also.
Okay, good. I mean, that's something just to explore further, right? Okay, thank you so much, people. I think this is, I'm really glad we did this together. It was great. Thank you. We'll see you next time, God willing. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.